Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. I am Pooja Sharma. I'm an associate consultant here at Viscaria, based out of our Boston office, and I will be the moderator for the event today. Before we get started, let's get some of the housekeeping items out of the way. So the audio for the attendees will be muted during the course of the event. We will be recording the webinar and we'll share a link with you after the event. And we'll have time for Q&A towards the end of the webinar. So please feel free to post your questions as and when they come using the questions icon at the bottom right corner of your screen. I will have access to those and I'll ensure that our panelist addresses them. With that, let me introduce our speaker for today. Doug is an economist by training. He has worked in life sciences consulting for over 30 years. Earlier in his career, he worked as chief methodologist for several large market research and consulting organizations. And more recently, he has focused on forecasting and commercial strategy. Now, a little bit about us. So, we are a specialized firm exclusively focused on empowering the life sciences industry with clarity and confidence through forecasting. We have offices across the US in Boston and Washington, D.C., and globally in New Delhi and our new office in Switzerland. And we've been in business for over 13 years now. So now when it comes to forecasting, we believe there are three core drivers to empower you. First, we help with market research. And to be more specific, we do all kinds of market research that exclusively just drives the forecast. So examples of this would be demand studies, conjoint analysis, buying process, and of course, segmentation that we believe here at Viscaria are all core inputs to forecast models. The second thing that we do is design and build models and platforms that help you across pipeline assets, BD&L assets, as well as on-market assets. And finally, the third thing we do for all our clients is cycle support. So while some of the things we do are episodic when it comes to models and platforms and market research, we also stick around and act as your trusted partner over a longer period of time. Some clients use us for their LRP processes. Other clients use us for their latest estimates, their monthly or annual processes. And of course, we're also in their ecosystem to help them on a short-term basis as well. So with that, I will hand over to Doug, who's going to be walking us through the agenda for today's webinar. Over to you, Doug.
Great. Thanks very much, Pooja. Great to be here. If you build it, they will come. That's a sort of a famous quote from a movie you may all know something about. The movie's Field of Dreams. The quote's from Ray Kinsella, a farmer and former baseball player played by Kevin Costner. And so in thinking about forecasting, I often find it useful to compare medtech and pharma. At least historically, medtech forecasts are sort of much closer to traditional sort of B2B manufacturing forecasts. We are actually really building a device. We're not choosing a molecule and hoping we get lucky in a sequence of clinical trials. We can really build it in medtech. This quote gets used regularly as a straw man for promoting customer research. The idea is that you can't really build it and they will come. You need to make sure the product you're building addresses an unmet needs and there's a market for it. Otherwise, there's no guarantee that customers will flock to it even if you think you're great. So more so than in pharma, we see the role of forecasting as allowing us to identify and really configure the right ideas so you can turn them into reality. Good forecasts allow you to make better informed decisions. And so today we're going to look at some of the unique challenges in medtech forecasting and some of our experience addressing these challenges to develop successful long-range forecasts. This slide just talks a little bit about basic medtech market data. Total global 2023 medtech revenue was just under $600 billion, forecast to grow to around $900 billion in 2030, roughly a 6% annual growth rate. For frame of reference, 2023 pharma sales were around 1.6 trillion. So global medtech is a little over 1/3 the size of global pharma from a revenue perspective. If you look at the graph on the left, you note the uptick in 2021. Those are sales associated with COVID testing. The chart on the right shows revenue by category. There are lots of different ways you could do this. This classification is from Evaluate MedTech. The top 5 categories are in vitro diagnostics, cardiology, ophthalmology, diagnostic imaging, and orthopedics, and they account for about 2/3 of the revenue in 2023. This slide just takes a look at industry trends in the industry. The panel on the top left looks at the number of medical devices approved in a given year by the FDA, where artificial intelligence or machine learning are included in the application. There has been a huge amount of press recently looking at use cases for AI and ML in pharma, mostly focusing on drug development, diagnosis and patient selection, and business processes. What is really interesting here is that AI and ML are really embedded in many of the devices that we're building. The tools for visualization, diagnostic pattern recognition and image processing, and a host of other applications. It's really cool stuff and lots of technology and development. There's incredible growth, more AI, ML powered devices in the past 3 years than in all prior years. An area where AI and ML gets used a lot is in surgical robots. The first major player in that market was Intuitive Surgical Systems, manufacturer of the Da Vinci system, which has been around for over 20 years. The chart at the bottom left shows the installed base for the Da Vinci systems, shows that it's grown from around 3,000 robots about 10 years ago to around 9,000 today. You'll note that the US has continued to grow as robots penetrate smaller hospitals and larger hospitals and hospital systems purchase multiple units. In the rest of the world, Europe used to be roughly the same size as the rest of the countries, but the rest of the world has grown faster, reflecting purchases of robots in Japan and China. There will be significant growth in surgical robotics in the next few years, as Intuitive's patents have started to expire. There are many players focusing on expansion of indications and new procedures, and technology like AI and ML is really expanding functionality in potential areas of application. The chart on the top right, we're looking at total global revenues for CGMs, continuous glucose monitors. CGMs have been commercially available for about 20 years, initially approved to monitor glycemic control for type 1 patients. Market has expanded to include type 2s and multiple daily injections. Insurance coverage and reimbursement has also improved globally, and market is now expanding to patients not necessarily on insulin therapy. And in the US, major players have developed some OTC products. The chart at the bottom right just looks at adult utilization of health apps across countries. Only some of these are classified as medical devices, and there's just a huge variation across countries, but the rate is pretty high. The US is in the middle. The chart really underscores the importance of digital applications from a global perspective. This slide just basically talks a little bit about the breadth and complexity of MedTech. On the left is our MedTech product wheel, just looks at the wide variety of different MedTech products in the market. The range is astounding. We've got remote patient monitoring, which is like the CGMs that we just mentioned, imaging for CT scans, MRIs, ultrasound, and X-rays, surgical devices, all sorts of tools, scalpels, scopes, implants, robotics, operating room technology. For drug delivery, we've got syringes, pens, inhalers, insulin pumps, cardiovascular devices, ICDs and CRTs, stents, pacemakers. For diagnostics, you have in vitro diagnostics, sort of the blood tests, but also sort of tests for minimum residual disease and genomic testing. There's all sorts of digital health apps and medical equipment, and anesthesia systems, patient monitors, and dialysis. This is a huge, huge range of products, and there are many different types of forecasts that you would do depending on the type of product and the market situation. So there's huge variation both within and across categories. So to keep things simple, we're going to focus on two categories for the presentation to sort of tee up some of the issues and the solutions, right? The first category is surgical robotics. I've had the opportunity to basically do 4 or 5 long-range forecasts for different products in development for surgical robotics in the past couple of years. So sort of gain some experience there and sort of understand some of the issues and where that market's going. And then the CGMs, we've done a fair bit of forecasting, both pre-launch and also for inline products for some of the major players in that industry. So we're just going to use those two sort of product categories to sort of discuss some of the major issues in and sort of developing long-range forecasts for MedTech products. This is sort of just a quick summary of some of those issues, right? We talked about the breadth and complexity of product offerings, right? You have to consider differences in regulatory pathways. There's, categorization by risk categories, and these differ by geographies. Levels of reimbursement, of course, are very important. They vary geographically and also influence product design and pricing. Data availability is a huge issue, limited in many countries and therapeutic areas. Pardon me. There's great variation in sort of training of doctors, their level of education, and their management practices across countries. In many of the medtech devices, this is also true in pharma, you have multiple decision makers sort of complicating purchase and use dynamics. Digital innovation and AI are transforming these medtech applications and use cases. And then you've just got this long development horizon where modeling product adoption and the adoption horizon is actually much more complicated than it is in sort of other applications. And so we sort of tee up those challenges, and we want to go through sort of each of those and then just sort of discuss them and then think about what the challenges are and also, some of the solutions that we use to sort of address them. And so to begin, we can just talk a little bit about sort of risk categories and regulatory pathways. And, important here to note that development pathways for medical devices are different than for pharmaceuticals. We don't really require that all new medical devices undertake clinical trials because in many cases, clinical trials aren't needed to determine the safety and effectiveness of the device. This is where risk stratification comes in. All countries have a stratification for medical devices. The stratification determines the approval pathway for the device. And so this slide shows a little about approval pathways in the US and EU just to get a flavor for some of the issues we need to consider. In both the US and EU, there are three broad buckets of devices: low risk, moderate risk, and high risk. In the US, the FDA is the one government body making approvals. And for the majority of low risk devices, they're classified as exempt. There's no clinical trials. The 510K pathway, also called a pre-market submission, is where the manufacturer prepares documentation to demonstrate that a device is as safe and effective as a currently marketed device. So again, there really are no clinical trials there. The pre-market approval pathway for high-risk devices is the most burdensome, requires scientific and regulatory documentation to demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of the device. PMA almost always requires clinical trials. Pre-market submissions for 510Ks do not necessarily require clinical evidence, but we may use engineering or other technical data to establish that the device is substantially similar to a current marketed device. In the EU, there are similar risk categories, but there's no one body that supervises approval for all medical devices. Rather, there is a collection of 38 entities called notable bodies that manage approvals by geography. The rules have changed recently with adoption of a new set of medical device regulations called the MDR. With approval, the device is granted what's called a CE mark. There's a low risk class, just like in the US, that are mostly exempt from review by notable bodies. There's a moderate class that requires what's called a conformity assessment and review by a notable body, right? And there's clinical evidence there. And then there's a class of high-risk devices that also requires clinical trials as well as the conformity assessment and review by a notable body. So if we think about, sort of the takeaways there, obviously we need to factor in the nature of the approval pathway and launch timing for the forecast. And then just like in pharma, in situations where there are trials with clinical endpoints, early stage research need to think about, just what clinical outcomes are going to occur, what's the range of possible clinical trial outcomes. And you sort of have to factor that into your demand estimates, your scenario planning, and your risk analyses. This slide talks a little bit about coverage and reimbursement, also, very important, and of course can vary widely across geographies. Here we look at coverage and reimbursement for surgical robots and CGMs to get a flavor of some of the issues. For the robots, in the US, there's no extra reimbursement for robotic surgery. A US hospital needs to cover the capital cost of the robot, which is usually somewhere between $1 million and $2 million, through increased use of procedures and improved clinical outcomes or cost savings in other areas. In the EU, reimbursement varies by country. When available, usually no additional reimbursement for robotic surgery, but typically the rates of reimbursement, not necessarily the rates, but the amount of coverage is less than in the US. And in Japan, the set of reimbursement procedures is growing. If approved, patients pay a 30% co-insurance with cap on monthly expenditures, and the rest is covered by government. Right. If we think about CGMs, the situation is a little bit different. Obviously, In the US and the EU, the products were only originally developed to cover T1D patients. Coverage has recently expanded to get some T2D patients on insulin, and coverage is sort of further expanding to consider other T2D patients that maybe are on other sort of diabetes medications. And there's also, I guess, as we mentioned, development of OTC devices for a number of manufacturers. For both forecasts, we need to account for the diversity in reimbursement environments and also factor in anticipated future changes in reimbursement. For robots, the set of approved and reimbursed procedures is also expanding. For CGM forecasts, coverage and reimbursement are expanding, but adoption is still very sensitive to patient out-of-pocket costs. CGM forecasts need to account for new opportunities with expanded coverage from insulin patients, as well as options to patients not on insulin. This slide just talks a little bit about the sort of the general situation, like in pharma, where sort of market opportunities are sort of influenced by multiple stakeholders. And this influences the structure of your demand research. For surgical robots, we have hospital administrators deciding whether or not to purchase the robot. If purchased, surgeons and other doctors basically decide on which patients and procedures to use the robot. And the payers decide whether to cover and how much to reimburse for robotic procedures. For CGMs, the patients can accept a doctor's recommended prescription. They can also ask their doctor to prescribe a CGM or purchase a CGM OTC. And so the DTC side of this is actually very important, right? If you look particularly in the United States, there's an enormous amount of DTC advertising by both of the major players in that market. The doctors can make a recommendation for a CGM, or they can grant a patient request to basically get a CGM. And the payers, they determine access, formulate placement, and restrictions based on price and therapeutic value. So a key thing here is in demand research, we need to ask survey questions that are tailored to each stakeholder audience and their specific decision context. We should not be asking robot purchase likelihood from hospital doctors who are not involved in robot purchase decisions. We shouldn't be asking hospital administrators how much they are going to use the robot if they're not treating patients, right? So key requirement there is basically tailoring the research to the stakeholders, giving the right decision context for sort of putting everything together. We talked a little bit about the long forecast horizon. When we're thinking about modeling sort of demand for and creating a forecast for a medical device, there's maybe three typical phases of these projects, right? There's a primary research component with two phases, a qualitative research phase where we investigate unmet needs, drivers, and barriers for use of the robot in specific procedures, and preliminary preferences for product features. In the quant phase, where we investigate trade-offs between product features and price, establish a minimum viable product, and also look at and consider upside versions. And then we develop the long-range forecast to quantify units sold and potential revenue for key market scenarios. So when we're thinking about adoption, analogs can be used to estimate adoption curves for robot purchase and for use of robot procedures. And so, there's there are more robots launching today, and there's a great incentive to use the data from those recent product launches to act as analogs in modeling adoption for the new robots. However, since the adoption period for robot technology is so long, if we use the data for recently launched robots, that time series is censored, right? We only see the front part of it. We haven't reached peak share yet for these newly launched robots. And as a result, it's difficult to distinguish between the different curves and sort of how long it takes to get to peak. And that picture is shown at the top in the middle here, where we have, looking at essentially the shape of the curves for, an 8 versus 12-year adoption period. And if you look at the data, in the first, 12 quarters, the first 3 years or the first 4 years, basically those curves are indistinguishable. Just saying that, there isn't so much information about what the long-term adoption curve is going to be for these devices when you've only got 3 or 4 or 5 years of experience. It's also important to note that manufacturers can invest in reductions in barriers to change the shape of the adoption curve. The idea is they can invest in training, additional evidence, better reimbursement, and as development progresses, basically the pace of adoption and basically the peak share can increase. Primary research and modeling can be used to estimate the increase in adoption speed and peak share as the market is shaped by investments in barrier reduction. The chart in the middle at the bottom shows both increase in speed of adoption and the increase in peak share resulting from barrier reduction. And in some robot markets, the peak share can go up by 10 or 15%. Essentially for manufacturers making these types of investments, as the product is being rolled out. Data availability is hugely important for medtech. I use the surgical robot as an example here. The chart on the right talks about data availability for the US, the EU, Japan, and the rest of the world. In the US, we have solid EPI, right? So that's the patient side, really good hospital universe data, wonderful data for medical claims and procedures linked to hospitals, and plenty of company data. So our situation in the US is great. In the EU and Japan, we've got EPI and company data kind of like the US, but there's less data on the hospital universe and procedures, right? And the data are not standardized across countries. And then outside of these countries, it's really hit or miss on everything except the company data, right? So in this situation, it's sort of useful to think of, how your forecast varies depend on the type of data you have. And, typically there are two versions of forecast. One's a top-down forecast and one's a bottom-up forecast. In the bottom-up approach, we start with EPI and claims as the foundation and include demand research to investigate product preferences and peak share. In the top-down approach, we use historical data on units and sales, plus additional assumptions to develop the forecast with predictive time series models. When we're data poor, we tend to use the top-down approach. When we're data rich, we use the bottom-up approach. And in practice, we like to take both approaches and triangulate to get the best answer. And then finally, this slide talks a little bit about approaches for creating a range or interval forecast. It's a very important view for a long-range forecast. When thinking about the long run, we need to recognize that we aren't 100% sure about what is going to happen in the future for all of the variables and assumptions that drive the forecast. A single point forecast really isn't so useful. We need information about the range of potential outcomes, realizing we don't know everything today. There are typically two ways to do this. So one is the traditional scenario analysis, scenario planning, where we create base case upside and downside scenarios in the forecast and look at the range of potential outcomes. This is shown at the chart in the top left. A little more involved is risk analysis, where we make assumptions about the distribution of forecast uncertainties and use Monte Carlo simulation to evaluate more granular variations in the forecast. This is shown in the panel on the right. In both cases, we get an estimate of the range of potential forecasts, which is very useful for quantifying risks. This is also very helpful for informing decisions and developing strategies for reducing risks. And finally, just some overall key takeaways. It's really important to account for the country level risk stratification and associated regulatory pathways when estimating the required level of evidence and time to market in the forecast. Demand research should be configured to include the right stakeholders in each country and to make sure we ask the right questions for those stakeholders. Forecast should obviously incorporate country level differences in coverage and reimbursement and factor in anticipated future changes that may be influenced by market shaping investments. For long-range forecasts, we should consider scenario planning and formal risk analysis to illuminate the range of potential outcomes. And then just finally, the forecast accuracy can be improved by considering both bottom-up and top-down approaches, particularly when the country-level data is limited. And that's it for the presentation today. Pooja, if you want to, perhaps take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. So we've received some questions. The first one is, you discussed the market for surgical robots a fair bit in the webinar. What are the factors that will drive increased use of surgical robots in the future? And besides cost, what are some of the barriers to adoption?
Okay, thanks for that question. So I think we mentioned a couple of drivers of use in the presentation. We're sort of looking at increases in indication, development of specialized robots that are sort of focused more on specific types of procedures. AI and ML have been playing a big role in the robot space for years, but they are only getting better. You sort of really get significant improvements in visualizations. That's really helping surgeons, basically do better at technically difficult, demanding procedures. For barriers, besides capital cost and reimbursement, the big things are absence basically when hospitals thinking about buying a robot, there are lots of training for the robots is actually really important. And, so there's a sort of a barrier, sort of the perception that, the training barrier is high and that it takes a lot to basically learn how to use them. And then the other thing which is actually important is just the lack of hard data on improved clinical outcomes and cost savings. There are groups of doctors and administrators that think there really aren't any cost savings or clinical benefits associated with using these devices. And so evidence generation is a big part of the product development plan for robots as a result. And usually training programs are a big part of the sale and the plan after purchase.
Thanks, Doug. The next question that we've received is, you mentioned using risk analysis for developing long-range interval forecasts in medtech. It seems like it would be difficult to gauge long-range uncertainty in these forecasts for many of the important risk factors. Can you talk a little bit about how you do that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it's useful to consider, before we answer that question, I think it's useful to consider what we do when we don't do the risk analysis, right? And so then we're basically focusing only on sort of one set of assumptions for the forecast that could be sort of quite a ways off, right? So looking at some variability obviously makes a lot more sense than just looking at one scenario. But where do we get those sort of estimates for the uncertainty? That's really the question. So sometimes we can use historical analogs, but for some of these products, there aren't so many. And there is a huge literature that looks at eliciting opinions of experts, about the distribution of forecast uncertainties to support risk analysis. And so for each of the major assumptions in the forecast, we ask a small group of experts who know about it. People who know about clinical risks, people who know about manufacturing risks, people who know about pricing and reimbursement risks, people who know about competitive risk. And these might be people on your marketing team, they might be KOLs, they might be people that are sort of in your manufacturing team. And basically you talk to a small number in each of those groups and then you factor in those estimates in the analysis. And so, there's standard tools for doing this. There's software for eliciting distributions that people use. So there's actually a significant body of science that's used to basically do that. But, it's basically to do the best you can with the data you have, asking people to sort of assess those risks and then using that to sort of provide an estimate of the variability in the forecast.
Thanks, Doug. The next question is, how accurate are these long-range medtech forecasts?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So it's important to remember that any long-range forecast is only as good as the inputs we have. We're never really sure what's going to happen in the future. So our forecasts for short-term forecasts are more accurate, right? Our forecasts for short-term planning horizons are more accurate. In pharma, we have a sort of a database of, forecasts and subsequently realized sort of market performance where we can go take a look at that. We have less of a base in medtech, so it's not something we've actually done. In both cases, though, I think the long range is about helping people make the best decisions along the development path. And so we can sort of do that with the accuracy we have, realizing that, there's going to be some misses just, based on the lack of knowledge on the assumptions about the future.
All right. Thanks, Doug. This marks the end of the webinar. Thank you all for your time. And we really hope you enjoyed learning more about, what are some of the strategies for developing global medtech forecasts. If you have any further questions or would like to continue the discussion, please don't hesitate to reach out to us via email. And we'll, of course, be sharing a link to replay the webinar with all the attendees. So thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.